Well, I grew up in an interesting family, which is, my father was from Mexico, from Durango, Mexico, which is in north central Mexico, and it's like really a western town where a lot of the John Wayne westerns used to be filmed back in the 1950s. And he came to the States when he was 15 and went to high school in San Antonio at this Catholic high school. And then he ended up going to SMU, which in Dallas, and became a mechanical engineer. And he would design plans for the electrical and heating and lighting systems for buildings, working with architects and stuff like that. And then in Dallas, he met my mama, and she was from Arkansas. She grew up on a cotton plantation, actually, in the Arkansas Delta. And so it's a weird sort of background. Very nice, actually, have being sort of bicultural is a really wonderful thing, actually, because you have this window into two different worlds. So I grew up in Dallas and Texas, and then in the middle of high school we moved from Dallas to Atlanta, where my parents lived for 3 or 4 years, and they moved back to Dallas, and I sort of stayed in Georgia. But it was funny because I have thought a lot about sort of how I got involved, in the small way that I was in civil rights stuff, and a lot of it was just luck, basically, just being in the right place at the right time, and. But other factors, I think one was that in high school I read a lot about World War II and the Holocaust. I mean, I read everything that was available at the time, every memoir by somebody who had fought in the war, and all about the concentration camps and everything. And so I was, and both my high schools in Dallas and Atlanta, had heavy Jewish populations, and so I was very affected by that. And so that when the civil rights finally came along, I made the analogy between the two things pretty quickly. And then the other big factor for me was the church. I don't know, did y'all grow up in church at all? Did y'all? Yeah.
Yeah.
And what kind of church? What flavor did y'all grow up in?
Roman Catholic.
Really?
Same. I went to Catholic high school.
Really. Fate worse than death, really. It's funny because my daddy was Catholic, and his mama and his sister and my cousin, they're all very devout Catholics, and my father was not, and he made a deal. My mother made a deal with him to get married that she would raise the kids Baptist, which is what she was, Southern Baptist, and that shows you what kind of Catholic he was, because that was fine with him. But it's interesting. But in the time I was young, it was still an issue, for Baptists. Catholics were suspicious people, and all the stuff about the papists and how bad they were and stuff like that, but anyway, I grew up in the Baptist church, and for a while I was pretty much into church. I think much more so than I realized at the time, and then and when we moved from Dallas to Atlanta, I remember there was, just before we moved, there was some magazine or something that was talking about school integration violence, desegregation violence. And so they had this map of the South, and it had flames coming out of Little Rock and flames coming out of places where there had been violence for school integration. And then this big question mark on Atlanta. And I was fixing to go to Atlanta to finish my last 2 years of high school. And I remember sort of thinking about it, but not thinking much about it. And then I went to high school, and nobody thought much about it until last year, which was when it was announced that the following year, the year after I finished high school, the first blacks would come into high school. And some of the junior boys talked about bringing knives because they want to take care of the niggers. They're not going to mess them around. And it turned out it was nothing happened. It was all very peaceful and stuff like that. And Atlanta had this whole system of picking the real cream of the crop. This the sharpest black students they could find, and there were 8 or 9 that desegregated the school that year. My sister was in the first desegregated class there at the high school we went to, and so that was that. And I still hadn't thought much about civil rights at all. I just a lot of the early stuff, the Montgomery boycott, I don't really remember that. It was I was too young at the time for that. And then I ended up going to Emory University in Atlanta, which is very much like AU, I think, actually, and I'm not sure why, because my high school in Georgia, in Atlanta, was much easier than my one in Dallas, and I made good grades, and so I could, I saw almost at my pick of schools, and I got accepted 2 or 3, a couple up north, and Washington and St. Louis and stuff like that. And then for some reason I decided to stay in Atlanta, which I still don't know why, but it was lucky for me because I would not have gotten involved, I don't think, if I'd gone away to school. And so in Emory at the time still had a required course in religion that everybody had to take. and it was taught by people from the theology school and the religion department, and it was a course in smashing fundamentalism, like Baptist, and I was all for it. I ate it up, and decided that I was not a believer anymore, and which is still the way I view things. But looking back on it, it makes me a little bit angry almost, actually, because here you have these professors in the theology school who actually don't believe the Bible as literally saying whatever, the way Baptists are supposed to. You're supposed to believe the Bible says what it says, and you're saved, and you go to heaven, and all that. And these guys don't believe it, and they're professors in the theology school, and how can that be? And they're turning out ministers who don't believe it, and yet they're the people they preach to every Sunday do believe it. And it just seems kind of hypocritical to me, but it's sort of an either-or choice. Either you believe or you don't, and I decided I didn't believe. But it still has had a big impact on me. And so then, I went away a couple of summers to work out west in picking peas, actually. 2 or 3 of us did. And then just before I went the second time, in my sophomore year, there was a talk at the theology school by a guy named Ashton Jones, Reverend Ashton Jones, who was a white Georgian. He had some kind of non-denominational church in Los Angeles by this time. But he would spend a lot of his time driving through the South in this car of his that was painted up with signs saying black and white together and love your brother and all this stuff. And he'd get the shit beat out of him everywhere he went, and run out of this town and beaten up here and bomb threats here and stuff like that. It didn't bother him, and that was what God told him to do, and so he was doing it. And I remember thinking that, I'm not a Christian, anymore, but if I was, that's what you ought to do. You really ought to do that kind of stuff. You ought to take it seriously and do it. And then I went away to work again that summer and out in Washington State, and then came back and found out that he'd been arrested. And he'd been arrested at First Baptist Church in Atlanta for trying to go to church with these black theology students from Atlanta University. And it pissed me off because, that was not my church. My mother had gone to, we'd gone to a different church in Baptist Church, actually the one that Jimmy Carter later went to when he was governor of Georgia. And but I played basketball a lot in that, and it just it was just outrageous to me that happened. And I read in the paper that there were pickets that were picketing the church on Sunday morning. So I said, well, I should go down there and join that picket line, even though I didn't, I was, and it's actually the thing that I think was the most courageous thing I ever did, because I was completely by myself. I just was acting on my own, and I went down and joined this picket line. And in high school in Atlanta, particularly, they had a civics course, and it was heavy anti-communism. Everything was communist this, communist that, and of course all the accusations were that the civil rights movement was communist-led, as communist that. So I was sort of terrified of being used by communists, and I wasn't sure that they wouldn't arrest us. So the police wouldn't arrest us. But I got off the bus and I joined this picket line, and I got very lucky because I fell in behind this really nice guy, a Japanese American guy who as an infant, had been in one of these internment camps during World War II. Mm-hmm. But he had just come down a few weeks before to work for SNCC, to volunteer for SNCC, and he's just a really nice guy. And so I started, went, a number of times to that, all those picket lines. And then at Emory, I had joined a Unitarian student group because, Unitarians, you don't have to believe in God even, so you can be an agnostic or an atheist and still be a Unitarian. So I went to that. And then one day this Howard Zinn, who was teaching, do you know who he is? He's a history professor who was, he wrote a People's History of the United States, which was very popular a couple of years ago. And he was teaching at one of the black schools at Spelman in Atlanta, and he brought over some black students from the Atlanta University Center, 6 or 7 of them. And it was the first time I'd ever dealt with black people as equals. I hadn't had much to do with black people growing up. It was it's funny because my mother, grew up with black people on this plantation, but I hadn't had much contact. And so and one of the guys I remember from that meeting was a guy named Barry Gaither, who was from South Carolina, and he now is the head of some really prominent African American art museum in Boston, and that's where he got to. But got to know him, and then started hanging out at the Summit at the Atlanta University Center, and he and some other people, some of his friends would hang out at the Episcopal Canterbury House, the Episcopal Student Center in the AU Center. And there was a guy named Father Warren Scott who was in charge of that. He was an Episcopal priest, he was this older black man, very distinguished, very soft, quiet kind of guy, really nice guy. I'd studied a lot in Europe, and it was sort of important for me to meet him because, you know, I had never realized there was this whole world of black people who were intellectuals and, you know, sophisticated and stuff like that. You know, it was that. And then I met a guy named Vincent Harding and his wife Rose Marie, and they were they had something called Mennonite House that was down there close to the Atlanta University Center, and so I would hang out there and some, and they were very important in civil rights. He actually ended up, he was the person that wrote the Martin Luther King's speech that he gave against the war in Vietnam the year before he was killed, and Vincent Harding wrote that speech for him, and Harding was one of these people that was just, I mean, gentle, you know, stereotypical Mennonite, just gentle, soft, nice people, but not soft about ideas and ideals, you know, and just pushing all the time. You know, people have to stand up, you have to be principled, you have to act, you have all that kind of stuff like that. He was he was just pushed us all the time, and so you know, I was feeling more and more sort of pressure to get involved, and so I started going to meetings that were being held over at the University Center to talk about whether or not, and if so, when, to resume demonstrations in Atlanta. They hadn't had them in a while and there were still some restaurants that were segregated. Some, one or two had desegregated, but a bunch of them are not. And so one day I was transferring buses from Emory. You go on the bus down to downtown to what's called 5 Points in Atlanta, and then you change buses. And so I was at 5 Points waiting for a bus to go into the black community, and there was this commotion up the street, 2 or 3 blocks up the street. And so I walked up to see what it was, you know, and it was in front of a hamburger joint called Crystal Restaurant, and there were 3 or 4 Klansmen in full robes inside the restaurant, and some black high school student had started this demonstration just on the spot when he saw him there, and so by the time I got there, there were maybe 50 or 60 people there, and the leadership of SNCC, which is, you know, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, they had heard about this demonstration. They came rushing over to lead this demonstration because, you know, they couldn't be sitting in their office while this demonstration went on. And so I was not trying to join the demonstration at all. I just wanted to see if it was really, I couldn't really believe that the police would be mean to people, which is what the civil rights people would say. And so I was trying to get close enough to where I could see, are they going to mistreat these people or not? And I kept edging closer and closer and closer. And I may have stepped over a police line, or maybe I just got too close, but all of a sudden I have this big hand on my shoulder, get this one too, bam, and all of a sudden I'm in a paddy wagon and arrested, you know. And so there I was. And so we went to the jail, and you know, a lot of these people have been arrested, you know, dozens of times, and no big deal for them, but of course it was a big deal for me. And then we got separated. You know, once we were booked in, we all sat around waiting to be booked in, and Jim Foreman, the executive secretary of SNCC, was there, and John Lewis was arrested, and a whole bunch of people. And so they were all sent to one cell, a black cell block in the jail, and I was sent to a white cell block. I thought by myself, and here I was in this white cell block, an open cell block, in a sort of a nasty place that had, you know, it was full of drunks, a lot of drunks, and they had the beds were made out of sort of pieces of steel woven together, so you could wash it easily when somebody threw up, you know. And it was not real comfortable, but I was sort of scared. It was very moving because I could hear the blacks downstairs singing freedom songs all night long. It was really, really something. But another thing, I was worried. And then after a while, this guy named Sam Shire came up and to talk to me, and he had been arrested as well. He was this white guy from Alabama, and his daddy was a Methodist minister, and his father had, at one point, he was in a church in Montgomery, and he had reached out to Martin Luther King, and Sam's daddy had, and then they were in another little Alabama town where George Wallace, you know, the governor of Alabama, was in their church, and had been Sam's Sunday school teacher when Sam was in the 5th grade. And in fact, George Wallace hung out at their house a lot. He used to sometimes would sleep over on their sofa and stuff like that. It was that kind of relationship with that. And so Sam got involved in civil rights, and SNCC had a project that to try to reach out to white people. It was a new project to try to reach out to white students, and Sam was the guy that was doing it. And so he comes up, starts talking to me, and he was a soft-spoken guy, just very, and you know, about how, well, there are a lot of people, you know, who are sort of concerned about this the way you are, and they're, you know, and we're going to have a meeting with those people in Nashville in a couple of months, and if you're interested, you know, I'll let you know. And so I told him I was interested, and then in the meantime, there was I think the next week, it's really funny the way all this fell together, there was a visit by the United Nations Subcommission on Human Rights or something like that to Atlanta. And I didn't know any of this at the time, but all through the Cold War, the Russians, the Soviets would beat up the U.S. all the time about racism and why do you tolerate this? Why don't you do something about something like that? And one of the American guy on the subcommission was a nice guy, an Atlanta lawyer named Morris Abrams, and he was on that subcommission. He wanted to show the commission that progress was being made and that Atlanta wasn't a bad place. And Atlanta had a reputation as a city too busy to hate, that it was not like Birmingham and some of these other places. And so SNCC called these demonstrations to show that Atlanta, in fact, was just as bad as everybody else. And so I decided I wanted to be there for that. And so I go over for that demonstration, and we're all in this little courtyard, and I think at Morehouse, just sitting and stuff like that, and waiting for these people, maybe 300 people, 400 people, something like that. And all of a sudden, here comes the commission. And they're all dressed up in their native garb. People have big flowing robes and turbans and all. And we sing Alicia Love, and I said, "Oh, this is really something." It was really, really. I mean, I just felt overwhelmed. I mean, it was a real religious experience, and I felt and still feel that I'm, part of this movement to, oppose racism and colonialism and all that kind of stuff from that. And then right after that, the demonstration started again at a restaurant called Leb's in Atlanta, which is one of the restaurants that refused to desegregate. And so we formed, some of us from white schools, there were 3 or 4 of us that formed this group called Georgia Students for Human Rights. And so we started, we would not sit in. There were sit-ins at this restaurant where people were getting arrested. We didn't do that, but we picketed along with it. We joined the SNCC picket lines. Sometimes we'd picket across the street, but it was, trying to say that there were whites, Southern whites, that agreed with this and thought it was wrong and stuff like that. And it's funny because somebody found and sent to me just a couple of years ago an article they found digging around of a black newspaper about welcoming this historic development that this group had been formed by white students and how much it was welcomed by so. We didn't know any of that. We were just down there trying to do our little bit, and it was funny because one of our guys from Georgia, he was from Georgia Tech, and he would Lester Maddox would come. Do you know who Lester Maddox is? He was a governor of Georgia after all this, but he was a white Georgian who was very opposed to integration. He had a restaurant called the Pickwick, and he would pass out axe handles to his patrons in case the race mixers came, they could beat them off, And it was a restaurant. It was pretty close to Georgia Tech, and it was a good restaurant. It had good Southern food, fried chicken and stuff like that. And but he didn't. I think he closed it rather than desegregate it. And but he would come and pass out leaflets across the street saying this race mixing, communists, and all this stuff like this. Terrible things are going on. And my friend would go up to me and say, "Let me help you pass these out." He'd take a big old thick stack of leaflets, and he'd go around the corner and put them in a garbage can and wait 10 minutes, and then go back and get some more leaflets and do the same thing over and over again. And then another time we heard about this. That there was going to be this new comedian from Chicago that was going to come down, Dick Gregory. Do you know his name at all? He was, he died just 2 or 3 years ago, not very long ago. But was really a good guy. And at the time, he was playing, I think at the Playboy Club or someplace, but he started to get national attention for being this hot young comedian from Chicago, and people said he was going to come down. And so we were all sort of wondering if that was going to happen. And all of a sudden, here he is, and he joins our picket line. And around this restaurant, and then the Klan comes. There's I don't know, 8 or 9 of them, maybe 10 or 12, in uniforms to have this counter picket line right on the other side of Forsyth Street, I think it was. And all of a sudden, Dick Gregory bolts and goes over and joins their picket line. And they look around in astonishment. What are we doing? What do we do? And they just pack up the rubs and go home. Rather than stay. And so anyway, I was getting pretty hooked by that point. And then finally we went to trial on my arrest, and there were 50 people arrested. And I kept asking the SNCC people, what about a lawyer? I need a lawyer. Don't worry about it. Don't worry, just show up. And so then I go, and I'm the very first case called. It's in municipal court in Atlanta, in police court. And of all these 50 people, and I think it's the prosecutors wanted to make this example of this Emory student, doing this crazy stuff. And so I'm the case, and then my lawyer turned out to be this very distinguished guy named Donald Hollowell, who was an older black man who was like the dean of the 3 or 4 black lawyers in Georgia at the time, and who'd done all this great. He got Martin Luther King out of prison one time, and he did this and that and the other. So, how do you plead? And the lawyer says not guilty. And then they have two cops that testify, and one of whom I later got to know and liked a lot, actually. But one says that he couldn't even remember whether I was there or not. The other says, well, he thought I was there, but wasn't sure if I did anything or not guilty. And I was like astonished. How can this be? There's no evidence that I did anything. How can I be convicted? But I was, and so that sort of sealed it for me, for doing all that kind of stuff. And then we had the meeting in Nashville that Sam had told me about in early April of '64, and then we formed this group called the Southern Student Organizing Committee, SSOC, and it was actually a project of SNCC. I mean, I didn't really realize. I knew Sam worked for SNCC. And then he had hired another guy named Ed Hamlet, this white guy from Jackson, Tennessee, who was working with him. And so I knew SNCC was much involved. I didn't really realize that it was actually a real affirmative sort of program and project of SNCC, but it was. And SNCC had been talking about the need to reach out to white people and not only focus on the black community. And people like Bob Moses, the legendary, he was pushing that, SNCC needs to reach out to white people. And Ella Baker, who's a very important person, she was pushing, saying the same thing, and other people. So anyway, we formed this little group, and then they met again about 2 or 3 weeks later for this continuations committee to figure out sort of once we were formed, how should we get organized and what should we do and stuff like that. So I was chosen as chairman, and the reason I was chosen as chairman was because I was not from Nashville. All the other people almost were from Nashville. And it's supposed to be a Southwide group, and so you need to get somebody in the leadership who's not from Nashville, so they picked me. And so I became the first chairman of SSOC. And then we had working with SNCC people, there was a project during the Mississippi Freedom Summer, that summer of '64, and it was called, we call it the White Folks Project, and it was designed to try to reach out to white people, And so most of us were down in Biloxi during the summer, most of the summer, which is down the coast, and a very interesting part of the state. And then a couple of people stayed in Jackson, and they worked with sort of the Human Relations Council, the Mississippi Council of Human Relations. And the rest of us down, and it didn't do much at all, actually. We'd spent a lot of time trying to figure out what to do, and the truth was there wasn't much that whites could do at that time. Things were so polarized and so tense, and there really wasn't much anybody could do. And we went around and talked to people. I went to talk to some labor people and some ministers, and gave a talk at a little Unitarian congregation in Gulfport, Mississippi, and stuff like that. But there wasn't very much to do. It didn't amount to much. The one thing that we did, 2 or 3 of our people went to a working class area, sort of a where shrimp fishermen lived in Biloxi, and they hung around there, and they found this guy who I think had been sort of hanging around in bars, and they recruited him, and he became a delegate for the Freedom Democratic Party to the convention at Atlantic City in '64. That guy did. That was our one accomplishment. I think it was tangible of any sort. But at the end of the summer, they had SNCC and COFO, the civil rights groups, had worked on the creation of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. Do y'all know about that at all? That was the alternative party because the white Democrats were totally racist, wouldn't let black participation at all. So they went through this whole program of, having precinct meetings and a state convention and all the stuff you're supposed to do to have a party. They did everything by the book, and then sent people up to Atlantic City and to say we should be seated as the real Democrats. And the problem was, most of the SNCC staff people went up there to Atlantic City, and they still had these freedom houses around the state, and they were looking for people to help staff those while everybody else was gone. And so I said, well, I can do that. And so I volunteered, and I was sent to McComb in southwest Mississippi, and it was a rough place, actually. I mean, I knew it was a rough place, before. I didn't know how bad it was. This was, before there was, communications and computers and stuff like that. So you didn't have access to much news at all. And so, but anyway, so we go up. This other guy that volunteered, and a guy named Bob Stone, and he had brought a car into the state. I think he was in school in Texas, I believe, and I didn't know him, but we were put together to go to McComb, and we had to go pick up his car in Hattiesburg, which was parked in the backyard of Victoria Gray. It was this older black woman who later ran for Congress from Mississippi, and so we picked up his car, and being sort of young and dumb, we set off at 7 o'clock that night or something to drive to McComb, which is 2 or 3 hours away. And I don't know why, but I was driving at one point, and there was this loud explosion, go bam, and I thought somebody had shot into the car, you know, and it turned out it was a blowout, you know, and so I pulled the car over, and Bob's, you know, congratulated me on not wrecking the car, and we went around to get the spare out of the trunk, and there's no spare. Somebody had stolen it, you know, while it was parked there over the summer. And what are we gonna do? You know, we're out in the middle of nowhere. It's dark, you know, and what to do? So we go up a long driveway to some farmhouse and knock on the door, and nobody comes, you know. And I feel sure now that they were calling the cops, you know, while back there in the back of their house while we were knocking on the door. But we go back down. We said, well, we'll try to walk to the next town, which is a little town called Tylertown, Mississippi. And after a while, the state trooper comes up and picks us up, says he'll give us a ride, and we're riding in the back seat. And he's very friendly, you know, but he's obviously trying to figure out who the fuck we are. And finally, Bob blurts out, "Well, we're freedom workers," you know. And I thought, oh fuck, man, you shouldn't say that, man. And because you know the cops in Mississippi were not, you couldn't count on them for anything, you know. They were, and sometimes they were in the Klan and stuff like that. And so I thought it was a big mistake. And then the trooper drops us off at this little country gas station on the outskirts of Tylertown. And there's this, you know, sort of good old boy that's young, not too old, but he's the attendant. He's in this little station, you know, has a little office, and then there's some gas pumps out front. And so we call McComb and say, can somebody come pick us up? And so we wait. And after a while, these guys start coming around, and they don't come into the station, but they walk around around the gas pumps out with baseball bats and clubs and stuff like that, and it's like 20 or 30 of them, bam, walking around, and the clerk says, "I wonder what the fellas are up to tonight." and we knew, but we didn't say. And finally, somebody comes up from McComb and picks us up, and the funny thing about it is that there was a reunion of a 50-year reunion of people who had been in Summer 64 back 2 or 3 years ago. And I was at a table, I was telling this story to somebody, and the guy across the front table says, "Well, that was me. I was the one that picked you up." Wow. And it's a guy who grew up in McComb, a white guy who spent his life as a Presbyterian minister after that. But he had been in high school, and he was a friend of this young woman in high school, and they were appalled in 1960, whenever it was, 63, when Kennedy was killed. And people broke into applause in the high school and cheering, you know, that Kennedy had been killed, and they were stunned by that. And then he got sort of involved in sort of hanging around the Freedom House just on his own, and he would park his car around back so that other whites wouldn't see him being there. So when we called, everybody else was in Atlantic City with all the cars, and he was the only one that was. So he came and picked us up, and so I spent about 2 weeks in McComb, and there was a lot of stuff going on. There was, one of the first nights we were there, there was this, we were standing around the living room talking, 2 or 3 people, and there's bam, everybody just dropped to the floor like that. And it turns out that there was the railroad track that ran way across the way. There was a big, track that going across. And the trainmen, some of the trainmen would, and it's the line from New Orleans to Chicago that the city of New Orleans train would go back and forth on. And they would shoot pot shots into the Freedom House, you know, while they were going by real fast on the train. And I don't think they ever hit anybody, but it was that. And then another time, Mr. Steptoe came in, and he was this legendary guy who had invited, I think in 1961, Bob Moses to come to Southwest Mississippi, and where he had started an NAACP chapter in Amite County, I think it was, not far from McComb, back in, I think, 1951. And he was this short, really wiry guy. And he walks in, he has this holster with this enormous revolver. Nobody's gonna mess with him, you know. And he was just a really gutsy guy, I mean, a really courageous guy. And then one night there was, they had a series of bombings in McComb all summer long. They had one just before I got there and one just after I left, actually, and just bombing after bombing after bombing. And I think they must have had a threat or something like that, but they wanted me to, can you go spend the night in in some black neighborhood? And I said, sure. And so they take me into this black neighborhood to spend the night. And to get there, you know, we drove through this in this car, and this was after dark, and there was this whole series of signals using headlights to say that we're friend, not foe. And then at these checkpoints were all these black guys with guns, I mean, just, you know, heavily armed to protect the neighborhood and stuff like that. So it was the first time I'd ever spent the night in a black home, you know, and it reminded me of my Aunt Grace in Arkansas. It kind of looked like her house, basically. And So then I went back, after that to school, because I had to deal with SSOC, this new group we'd created, and stuff we were trying to do.
Awesome. Were there differences between your activism in Atlanta versus Mississippi, like rural versus urban activism?
Yeah. Well, Mississippi stuff was so that summer it was so stark, I guess. There was Mississippi the whites in Mississippi just freaked out about the possibility of having this freedom summer. The mayor of Jackson, bought a tank, for the police to use, and there were the 3 people that were killed, and during the time that they were searching for those bodies of the 3 that were killed, they uncovered, I forget what it was, 7 or 8 other bodies, including this 14-year-old kid who had a T-shirt saying "Core" on it and stuff like that. So it was bad stuff, and I think the thing that saved us in Tylertown was that by that time, President Johnson and Bobby Kennedy, who was Attorney General, had been forced to send the FBI in. I mean, there was so much of an outcry. So the FBI had sort of flooded the state, and I think the Klan, people knew that they had to be careful, and couldn't go too far. So I think that probably helped us in that thing in Tylertown. So it was that kind of really rough stuff. Later on, the next summer, I'd taken some time. I dropped out of Emory for a quarter, maybe 2 quarters, to work for SSOC full time, and then I came back that summer and fall of '65 to finish college. And I lived in a black neighborhood in Atlanta called Vine City, which is a very poor. Well, it's not very poor. Next to it was a town called Lightning, which is where the stadium is now. The Mercedes-Benz Dome, the big football stadium is where Lightning used to be. And then next to it is Vine City, and then next to that is Clark University, one of the black schools. And Vine City had, it was mixed. Most of it was pretty poor, but Martin Luther King and Coretta King lived on the edge of Vine City on a street called Sunset. And so I lived there, and this guy I knew a black guy from Morehouse had grown up in the neighborhood. He was trying to start this community organization. He wanted to do some civil rights stuff in his home neighborhood, and so I lived in this community center that was rented for that purpose and for those months. And nothing much came of it. We didn't actually do much, but it was that. And then later on with SSOC, we were all feeling this pressure to try to do something. Let's really reach out to whites. I mean, that was the imperative we all felt. And so how can you do that? What makes sense to do that? And some people, went off into the mountains in Appalachia to try to work with coal miners or do sort of community organizing in the mountains, that kind of stuff. That didn't make much sense to me, to be wandering around the mountains, saying you're a community organizer. And so when I was at Emory, we had tried to help organize the campus workers at Emory with AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, and that didn't go very far either, but I had a little bit of labor experience with that. And so we got involved in a project in North Carolina in which we were involving students in textile workers organizing. And this was like in '67, I think, something like that, and '68. And so we worked on 2 campaigns up there, and it was really good stuff. And we got, like hundreds of students from the University of North Carolina and other schools involved in this campaign against cone mills, which had, I think, 8 or 9 mills across North Carolina. And at the time, it was the largest producer of denim for blue jeans in the world in Greensboro. And there was a very imaginative organizer, a guy named Peter Brandon, who was the company, like many big companies, had been forced to recognize the union during World War II. It was the only way you could get a government contract is if you recognize the union. But then after the war, they broke the power of the union and refused to agree to what the union wanted. And so there was, on paper, there was a union there, but in fact, there was not really a real union. So we were trying to get a real union back at Cone Mills. And so his idea was to have a 1-day strike, which would show people that they could have some power, and then they'd go back, and then have a 2-day strike, and then a 3-day strike, and then a real strike, and then you would, by that time, you'd have built up all this power. So that's what we were working on, and as I say, we had several hundred students working on picketing, with the workers and meeting with workers and stuff like that. There's this really fun. One of the mills was in Salisbury, North Carolina, which is down towards Charlotte, and this was a mill that didn't have as many black workers. The thing was that that at this time, blacks were starting to, because of the Civil Rights Act, blacks were starting to come in for jobs other than sweeper. Before they'd always just been the cleaning people, and now they were getting jobs as spinners and other things in the mills. This mill had relatively few blacks, but there was a black college in Salisbury called Livingston College, and so these black students from Livingston start coming to the picket line to help the strikers there. And one day I'm down there in the union office, and this phone call comes, and it's the black students saying, "We can't come because the Klan has been threatening the college, and if we don't stop, they're going to do something to the college." And the college president says we have to stop, so we have to stop. And and the guy, one of those strike leaders, the white guy, and he picks up the phone and starts cussing. He picks up the phone, he dials somebody. He says, "Frank, those Livingston students, they're trying to help us. Now y'all stop. And he hangs up, and the Klan stopped, and the students came back, just like that. And but anyway, we lost the strike. It was a wonderful thing, and the thing that I had been nervous about working among white workers after working in the black community, and thought it would be difficult to get white workers to reach out to work with blacks and stuff like that. It turned out it wasn't at all. It was just a piece of cake because the white workers would watch the news every night, like all the rest, and there was civil rights doing this and civil rights doing this, and Congress passed this one law, and Congress doing this. So from their point of view, blacks knew how to get stuff, and were getting stuff. Every time you turn around, they were getting something. So we got to be sure and get them involved because they know how to do it. So it was easy actually to get blacks and whites to work together in the union. And then after that, we went on another campaign in eastern North Carolina, and at a place called National Spinning, and it was way out in the country, and it was a mill that was relatively new, and they had the pick of the crop, whereas cone mill had come down in the 1890s from New Jersey or someplace, and this was a fairly new mill, and so people had come off the farm, young people had come off the farm to get these jobs at National Spinning. So when they went on strike, they could go back to the farm, and they weren't all sort of out on the street the way the workers were in Greensboro, and so it was a pretty strong strike, and it lost as well. I mean, we couldn't. It was one of the things we did when we first got there, and they have in a strike you have a strike committee, which is like the leadership of the union, and they pass out the strike relief funds, and they sort of are the management for the strike, working with the staff of the union. And the strike committee was all white, even though there were a fair number of blacks, and so we said that's got to be changed, and it was changed. And so the co-chairs of the strike committee became a woman named Nancy, who was the local NAACP leader, and a woman named Mary, whose husband was the head of the Klan, everybody said, and I presume that he was. And but we were trying to figure out what we could do to push the company to treat the workers right. And so the Selma to Montgomery March had happened 2 years before, and it was a march of 52 miles, I think, between Montgomery and Selma, from Selma to Montgomery. So we were located 50 miles from Wilmington, North Carolina. We were in this little small town, but we were 50 miles away. So let's have a march, just like the Selma March, basically. And so we proposed that to the workers, and they said sure, and everybody's so excited about it. And the issue of whites and blacks walking together on down the highway wasn't a big deal. That was fine because people were together on the picket lines. The question was sleeping together at night, when camping out on the route. And some whites wouldn't do that, but a bunch of them did, including this one woman who had Inez, and she was redhead and just fiery, feisty person. And she was apparently the best spinner that National Spinning had in the whole company, because a couple of years before they had flown her to one of their other plants to spin some silver thread to make a coat for Liberace. You know who Liberace was? And so they were making some fancy good piece of cloth for him, and she's the one they got to spin the stuff for it. But she says, well, "Sure, I'll stay." And so she and a bunch of other whites actually stayed on there. And so we had this freedom march, for labor rights, but it didn't get any national coverage, and it didn't push the company, and so we lost that as well.
Mm-hmm. Could you talk about the Great Speckled Bird and why you started that?
Well, I came back to Atlanta after we lost the National Spinning Strike, and with my wife and my then wife, and because I had to deal with the draft, and that was a big deal for people my age, and I couldn't figure out. I mean, for a while I didn't know what to do about it, and then finally I decided to apply for as a conscientious objector, and so I did, and they turned me down all the way because my beliefs were non-traditional. I mean, I had been in the Army ROTC in high school in Dallas, and then in Emory in my first year I was in the Air Force ROTC, and then here 2 years later I'm asking to be a CO, and it's sort of understandable why somebody would be a little skeptical. But I made this whole argument that non-violence, I'd been heavily influenced by non-violence, and I'd been transformed, and da 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 da. But it didn't take, and so I was going to have to refuse induction, and the Army. So one day in December, I go down to the induction center on Ponce de Leon in Atlanta, and refuse induction, and then wait for that to be dealt with. But at the time, there was a very good friend of mine who was active in SOC with me. He and a guy named Howard Romaine. And he was interested there were beginning to be some what we call underground newspapers. The Los Angeles Free Press, I think, had been formed by then. And then in New York, it was the Village Voice, which just went out of business a year or two ago. But it was more sort of an establishment paper, but it was an alternative. It served Greenwich Village in New York. And the LA Free Press was more of a sort of a counterculture paper than the Village Voice was, but they were alternative papers. And so he wanted to start one in Atlanta, and so he starts trying to find people, and I was interested, and my wife was interested, and we got together a group of what eventually it was about 20 people, and including a couple that had come down to Emory for grad school from Reed College in Oregon, and they had a little newsletter they were publishing at Emory, and so we decided to start this newspaper, and it took us a long time to figure out how to do it and all this kind of stuff like that. But it was just the right time, to do it. And Atlanta was dominated by this newspaper and this TV station that were all owned by the Cox family from Ohio.
Yeah.
And they weren't bad people, I don't think, actually. But the papers were pretty conservative. They had a guy named Ralph McGill, who was one of the editor of the Atlanta Constitution. He'd been the editor for 400 years, and he was thought about as this courageous liberal who was progressive on race relations. In fact, he was pretty moderate and pretty timid compared to some other white Southern newspaper editors across the South. He was really quite timid, and the paper was not all that good. But so our first issue was this mock obituary of him. He wasn't dead yet; he died a couple years later. But about how his time had passed, and here we were, and. So we started this newspaper, and it took off, and we had an office in this area of Atlanta at Peachtree and 14th, which was an area of town which is now very developed and full of all these nice buildings and stuff, and close to the High Museum of Art. But at the time, developers had bought up a lot of the property, and they were waiting for it to be redeveloped, which didn't happen until 10 years later or something like that. And so it was sort of a seedy area at the time, and so we had a big house there, and that was where young people started coming in, and it became a center for hippies, and our newspaper was there, and then the way that hippies could make money was to sell our newspaper. So they would sell newspapers, and I think they were sold for a quarter after a while. And pretty soon we started off as every 2 weeks, and then we became a weekly newspaper, and pretty soon we were the largest weekly newspaper in the state, and it was a big deal actually. And we were lucky in that we had a number of people, not me and not my close friends, but some other people in the paper who were really into the arts community. So they were into like theater and music and poetry and nice photography and stuff like that. So the paper was much more balanced and nice to look at than some of the other undergrounds around the country, which were just sort of ranting from the New Left, And we had all of that. We had a lot of ranting from the New Left, but we had some other stuff as well. And so it got a following, and we had problems with the police, and we started covering music, and we had this one guy from Alabama, Miller Francis, who was a thoughtful, music writer, and he wrote a lot about when the Allman Brothers. Do you know about the Allman Brothers? Do you know them? And so, they're from Macon, Georgia, where they kind of got their start, and he started writing about them very early on. And then we had a benefit for our newspaper in the local park, Piedmont Park, featuring the Allman Brothers. And we ran a cover, which was of the Allman Brothers naked in a creek, and that was the cover of our newspaper for that issue. And so we helped them get started, actually. And it's not they would have gone they're good, so they would have gone anyway. But we played some role in that. And so our music coverage was was big time, and so record companies started to advertise in the paper. They would buy like a full page ad from Columbia Records or RCA or this and the other, and all of a sudden they stopped buying records and buying ads, and so we went and asked them, well, the FBI came and they asked us to stop, and so we have to stop, and so they did. But we had enough other kind of advertising and sales that we were able to keep going for that, and it was a good thing.
Our professor grew up in Atlanta, and
oh really?
Yeah, when we told him that we were interviewing you, and we mentioned that you started the Great Speckled Bird, he was like, "I used to read that."
Yeah. What's his name, Professor?
Greg Ivers.
Don't know the kind of name.
Yeah, he's a cool guy.
Yeah. How old is he roughly? Do you know?
I don't think he was old enough to be.
Yeah, around.
Yeah, he was younger.
Yeah.
But it was funny because he knew about
He's
the
been
Great
into
Speckled
that.
Bird.
Yeah.
Well, it's funny because Georgia State University has not digitalized all the birds, so you can go in there to the library and you can read it, which is nice because, if you have a paper copy, they fall apart now. You can't even read it anymore and hardly. But I had a really nice thing to experience because I wrote about country music. I started writing about country music, which I like a lot, and I just and it took off sort of. It was a big deal. And I was unsure myself as a writer and stuff like that. But I started doing all this country music stuff, and and it was interesting the contrast. Because I would go along on some of these interviews with rock legends, and they'd sing about peace and love and change, and they were assholes, just utter jerks. I mean, really just jerks, really shitty people. And the country people you go interview, they're just the nicest people in the world, They're just wonderful people. And part of it was the country people, there was no pretense about them. They were in the country music business, and they were trying to sell records. And sure, they're going to be nice to people that are interviewed, but also they were just nice people. I think, it wasn't an act necessarily. It was they were very nice and stuff like that. But anyway, I wrote a bunch of music pieces, and which many of which I didn't have or didn't know how to find them and stuff like that. So this British, some smart people in Britain decided to start a sort of a music archive. It's called Rock's Back Pages, and it's you can subscribe, and I think libraries probably is where they make all their money. And then you can read all these articles they've put online, digitalized, and so they found the bird and they put all our music articles, including mine. So I was able to collect all my articles and read them and stuff like that. And so I interviewed Loretta Lynn, you know who she is, and Conway Twitty and Waylon Jennings and Dolly Parton. It was really funny because one of the early ones was Dolly Parton, and she had this her first album had a song called Evening Shade, and it was about this orphanage where the people were real mean to the kids, so the kids rose up in revolt against that. So that was our message, So I wrote this review of this album saying this is this great new album by somebody called Dolly Parton, and I get this letter in the mail, which I still have, and it's Dear Gene, Porter Wagner, I want to thank you for the review you had in the basement of Dolly Parton, and her Dolly is one big circle, and P is a big circle. I don't where she gets the two circles from. I don't know, so then I contact them, at our offices. Well, can we come interview you? And they say sure. And so we set up this interview, and we were, not very sophisticated people, so we didn't even take a photographer. We just had a tape recorder and two of us, and we go to their office and thinking we're going to interview Dolly, and she comes out and they're all in her stage clothes for the photographer, and there's no photographer. And then she says, "Can we interview Porter as well?" And she sang originally with Porter Wagner, who was his older country music star and a good guy actually. And so we say sure, and he's got his nudie suit, these the spangles and stuff like that on for the photographer. But we did this wonderful interview, this long interview with her, and just wonderful people. And at the end we were about to leave, and he says, "Oh wait a minute, I want to play you this new song that Dolly's written." And so he goes over this big old, at the time tape recorder with big reels, and he punches a button, and it's her first version of "I Will Always Love You." Wow. If I should stay, I'll go.
That's incredible.
That's crazy.
Yeah, it's good.
And what year was that? What year was the Great Speckled Bird?
It started in early '68, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, and then went till I left around 72 or 73, and it went on for another 3-4 years after that. Yeah, but it went off the deep end. I mean, just like the whole new left. I mean, the whole new left just sort of, went off the deep end, and we stopped, being something that people really kind of wanted to read. It got too sort of hysterical or stuff like that. It's not that sometimes we were wrong about. Part of the, looking back. I mean, I don't think that there was a lot of bombings, in the state. The weathermen went off, including some people I knew a little bit, but who went off and started bombing things and stuff like that, crazy stuff, and which did a huge amount of harm to the progressive sort of movement, and led to Richard Nixon and Law and Order and all that stuff like that. But and I don't think we criticized that. I mean, we covered it and we would write about it, but not in a critical way at all. And so we did not play much of a role, which that we should have, I think, in sort of saying, wait a minute, this is not good,
Yeah.
this kind of stuff.
As the civil rights movement kind of ended, how did you stay involved, or did you stay involved?
Well, I was lucky because I it's hard to find, people have trouble finding places where you can do the kind of stuff you want to do and get paid for it. And I was lucky because this friend of mine that I'd gone to Emory with, she had been working half-time. The ACLU in Georgia had an office that had 1.5 people in it, and she was the half person. And she wanted to come work for the Bird. And I wanted to leave the Bird and get a part-time job where I could keep writing, but I would have a different job, because it was putting out a newspaper was hard. It was you have to every week, and it's just it's kind of like having cows. You just have to do it all the time, And so anyway, so we traded jobs basically. So I went to work half-time for the ACLU Georgia, and then the full-time director decided she wanted to leave and asked me if I was interested, and I said sure. And the board was sort of spunky enough or courageous enough to hire me, even though I was this kind of weird guy. And so I became the state director for the ACLU for the next, 17 or 18 years until I moved up here.
Awesome.
Yeah.
What's your current job? Or you're retired?
I'm retired now, but I was a lobbyist here in Washington for the years I was here, the 25 or so years working here. And I started off in the ACLU's legislative office here. And I worked for a time for a year for Public Citizen, one of Ralph Nader's groups, kind of a crazy place. And then for Human Rights First, and then for the Open Society Foundation, which is George Soros's group, and mostly on criminal justice reform. And it's funny about lobbying, you just spend all your time, and you do, when you're able to accomplish something, it can be a pretty big deal, but you can spend years, going by without doing anything, and then but you have to do it in order to be in this position where you can do something. So, I had 2 or 3 things I did which I'm proud of. One of them was that, as ACLU, we got legislation in to give the Justice Department the power to investigate and act against patterns and practices of abuse by police and prison officials. And that had not been in the law, and so the Justice Department wasn't doing that. They weren't attacking that, and so now they do that. And that was something that I was very much involved with. And some of the early reform of criminal justice law, the mandatory minimum stuff, we were very much involved with that. And then, we worked on a bill that finally passed in 2008 called the Second Chance Act. Yeah. And you know about that, and it was, it's funny because, that we started working on it, and we've been hired to work. This other person had worked at the ACLU with me, and we were hired to work in this office of George Soros, and we were supposed to work in criminal justice reform, and we both looked at each other and rolled our eyes. What the fuck can we do that has any chance at all of doing anything at all? But there was good jobs that we wanted to work in, and a good group, and so we were trying to fish around for something to do, and we came across the reentry as something to do. What happens to people when they come out of prison? And we started working on that, and we formed this little coalition of different groups who work on different aspects of it. And so you have people who work on jobs, housing. Some of the low-income housing people were interested in that, and then people who work on counseling and drug addiction, this, that, and the other. So we put together this model bill. This guy Ron Weitz was one of the people that helped us on that, and so we had a model bill. And then George W. Bush gets elected president, and he's a compassionate conservative, he says, and he wants to do some things. And I've since read some accounts of his White House, and it's really funny because there's this quote of Karl Rove, was one of his people, and Karl Rove is quote saying, "I don't give a fuck what it is, let's just do something that we can say is compassionate conservatism." And so here was prisoners of reentry, they would read that bill. So we had some Republican support. I mean, the White House never actually did anything to help us get the bill passed, but we could say that they were for it, and they wouldn't contradict us. And we had a Republican senator from Kansas, a guy named Sam Brownback, who was one of the leading sponsors of it in the Senate. And he was a guy who'd been a Methodist, and then he became a Catholic, and he was very conservative, but he was genuinely religious in a good sense, And he'd spent the night in a prison at one time with people, and he was on the board of some halfway house in Kansas City or something like that. So, and then on the House side, our lead sponsor was a congressman from Chicago, a black guy named Danny Davis, who's just a wonderful congressman and very active in civil rights over the years and stuff like that. So it was this unusual sort of alliance of people. And people told us to stop. I guess it might have been Ron White, who had worked for Kennedy, said that Ted Kennedy used to tell people it takes 5 years to get a bill passed in Congress. It took us 4.5 years. I couldn't believe it would take that long, but it was really hard. And it's funny because we got it through the House finally. We had as much trouble with Democrats as with Republicans, because Democrats get territorial, and they, if it's not their bill, just you have to work through all this crap, this silly crap all the time. And then on the Senate side, one person can stop a bill. You can put a hold on it and you can stop it, and basically. And so we had this series of holds that were being placed on it by various Republican senators, and we thought it was this organized sort of conspiracy to keep our bill from passing. And one of the last people that put a hold on was Senator Shelby from Alabama, who we thought was going to be good. He had been a Democrat before he switched to Republican. He was good on juvenile justice stuff, but he put a hold on the bill. And the next day, I was supposed to go speak at this organization of people that teach in prisons, the Correctional Education Association. They had their annual, everybody has an annual day when people come to Washington to Lubbock. And so this was their annual day, and it was like 12 people, and most of them white-haired, people that teach in prisons. And now, who would the people have the least influence, least power in the world? It's going to be people that teach in prison, And I almost didn't go. Because the day before I'd found this, yet another hole was put on. We're never going to get this damn bill passed, even though we'd gotten it out of the House after a lot of effort, and we were never going to get out of the Senate. I almost didn't go, but then I went, and so I'm talking to him, and I say to Senator Shelby, and if you know anybody from Alabama, and two little ladies say, "Oh, we're from Alabama." And I said, "Well, please, contact Shelby." And we have an appointment with his office today at 5. And so I say, "Well, please get him." And so what they members of Congress do, if they can, if they're in the office, and some constituent people from their home state just come, they will come in and meet him by 2 seconds, so the person will go home and say they met Senator so and so. And so Shelby does that, and they grab him and they say, "Please help us pass this bill." He didn't even know he had a hold on it, I don't think. And so I'm sitting on that sofa there about 7 o'clock at night, and I had the BlackBerry, and my BlackBerry goes off, and it's since actually in the second chance I could just pass Congress. And it was because he went back and he lifted the hole, and it passed the bill.
That's incredible.
From these two little white-haired ladies.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
What would you say to someone who wants to get involved with activism or civil rights or lobbying today? Like, what did you learn from those experiences? Well,
I think one thing is that you have to be sort of proactive, I think, and really try to seek out ways that you can be involved. And I think it's important to try to focus on stuff that will make some difference. And there's a whole long list of issues that you can choose. I think one of the big things I think is America's role in the world. And the bad role we've played over all of my lifetime is terrible things we've done everywhere, over and over and over and over again. But there are a whole long list of issues, and so that's one thing. And then the other thing is to really be sort of assertive, and to try to push, to focus on how do you win. The goal is not to. If you just want to spout off, you can just. There are demonstrations where you can hold a candle if that's your thing, or you can go and talk about this and that, the other. But if you're serious, if you really want to change the policy, then you got to figure out how to do it. And that may not involve what you think it might involve. And you've got to reach out to your Aunt Betty and your Uncle John and just the kind of people like that. You've got to be able to. Somebody's got to reach them on those issues and the people that represent them. And so you've really got to be. You've got to fight back against those people who are crazies. And everybody has crazies, and everything you're ever involved in, they're crazies. But you got to push back about that and really try to insist that you be. And being sensible doesn't mean that you're not forward, that you're not moving forward, and that you don't take principled positions, and that you're not radical or however you want to define it. But it means that you really want to try to win, and so I think that's really, really important to do. And then the other thing that helped me, I think, was that I got to know early on some of these a few older white people that have been involved in the movement, before me, in the generation before me. And, one was this guy named Miles Horton, who helped start Highlander Center, which is this center in Knoxville. And they just had a fire down there a few days ago. But it's where, Rosa Parks went before she was on the bus boycott, and it was stuff like that. And so I knew him and 3 or 4 other people like him. And at some point, I actually sort of consciously said to myself, well, I want to try to figure out a way that I can do what they've done and sort of stay involved over my lifetime. And so, that's another thing, to try to figure out ways that you can keep involved, whether it's your, working a straight job or whether you figure out some kind of nonprofit, whatever it is, try to figure out what to do about it. And then the other thing is to kind of, look after yourself, don't get burned out, and pay attention to family and relationships and all that kind of stuff like that. And then the other thing that's interesting about it is my experience coming up to DC. I thought it was interesting because maybe I've changed a lot. Maybe I've gotten conservative in my old age, but I don't think so. But lobbying on the Hill, and spent a lot of time lobbying on the Hill, and getting to see how it works, and members of Congress, I became much less cynical about politicians than I was before. Because in fact, it's really a tough job, to how to move ahead. You take somebody like Wellstone or Sherrod Brown or somebody like that. I mean, it's not an easy job, because you got to get, you want to move things forward on the issues you care about. You want the party, to move forward. You don't want to damage the party. You want to get reelected. It's important actually to do that, and you want to make people happy. All these things. And it's just really tough to do actually, because they're not easy situations, and really, really tough to do. So, I have a lot of respect for people who and there are a lot more members of Congress, including some that I don't disagree with 100%. Some people are bad guys, but they're principled people. They think they're doing the Lord's work, and they're trying to do what they think is right, stuff like that. So, you got to treat people respectfully. I think this business about yelling at people in restaurants, for example, is just shameful. I mean, it's just awful. It's not gonna. Aunt Betty and Uncle John are not gonna be impressed by that. And you shouldn't do that kind of stuff. So you gotta be serious about it and be trying to win on the things you're working on. I think that all those things are pretty important.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We really appreciate
Yeah,
this.
yeah, it's a pleasure.